The silence that fell over the Obsidian Court was not the ordinary silence of a room gone quiet. It was the silence of 300 years of tradition shattering against the floor like fine crystal, the silence of immortal breath collectively held, the silence of something so unprecedented that even the eldest vampires among the gathered nobility forgot, momentarily, the careful masks of indifference they had spent centuries perfecting. Eloise Sinclair stood in the center of the great hall, with her chin lifted and her dark eyes burning. And she said, no. She said it clearly. She said it without flinching. She said it to Sorin Nocturne, Lord of the Obsidian Court, sovereign of the northern reaches, the most dangerous immortal being in a room absolutely crowded with dangerous immortal beings. And she said it while every single one of those beings stared at her as though the floor itself had spoken. No, she repeated, because the first time had apparently not been sufficient. I will not kneel, I will not recant, and I will not name Mira as a traitor to save myself. She is not a traitor. She helped me escape, and she was right to do it. The court erupted 300 vampires, all of them pale as moonstone, all of them clothed in silk and shadow and centuries of inherited power, all speaking at once in voices ranging from outrage to something closer to disbelieving laughter. Somewhere near the eastern colonnade, an elder vampire named Vespa fainted, which was remarkable given that vampires were physically incapable of fainting from shock, and yet here they were. And through it all, Sorin Nocturne did not move. He sat on the obsidian throne at the far end of the hall, one long finger pressed against his lips, his white hair cascading over one shoulder like spilled moonlight, and he watched Eloise with eyes the color of deep winter ice and something burning at the center of them that was not cold at all. He had issued a direct order. He had asked her, in front of the full assembly of his court, to kneel as custom demanded of a brought-before mortal, and then to reveal the name of the vampire who had smuggled her out of the court's territory 3 weeks ago. It was standard procedure. It was blood law. It was, in 500 years of the Obsidian Court's existence, something no mortal had ever refused. The court's head enforcer, a lean and ancient vampire named Dravik, who wore his white hair cropped close to his skull and his authority like a second skin, stepped forward from his position at the throne's left side. "My lord," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos with the precision of a blade, "the mortal refuses direct address. Blood law permits immediate Dravik." Sorin's voice was quiet. That was the terrible thing about it. It was perfectly, utterly quiet, and the entire room went still around it, the way the surface of a lake goes still before something massive moves beneath it. "I will handle this." He rose from the throne. When Sorin Nocturne stood, the room changed. It was not merely that he was tall, though he was, well over 6 feet, with the effortless posture of someone who had commanded rooms for 5 centuries. It was not merely that he was beautiful in the specific, cutting way of his kind, all sharp angles and pale skin and those extraordinary eyes. It was the weight of him, the presence, the sense, completely rational and completely physical, that this was a being who could and would remake the world around him, if he chose to, and who was currently choosing not to, which made the implied alternative exponentially more terrifying. He descended the 3 steps from the dais and crossed the marble floor toward Eloise, and the gathered court parted before him automatically, an unconscious tide. Without a single vampire appearing to notice they had moved, he stopped 4 feet from her. "Leave us," he said. The court blinked at him collectively. "All of you," he said. "Now." They left. Even Dravik, though his jaw was a rigid line of displeasure that promised extremely detailed complaints at a later date. 300 vampires filed out of the great hall in a rustling, muttering stream, and the enormous obsidian doors swung shut behind the last of them with a sound like the closing of a tomb. And then there was only the vast, torch-lit hall, the rows of carved black columns rising to a ceiling lost in shadow, the cold blue glow of the underground city visible through the hall's tall windows, and Eloise Sinclair, standing with her hands steady at her sides and her heart hammering so loudly, she was entirely certain he could hear it. He could. She knew he could because she had spent 3 weeks trying to get away from this court and its lord and everything they represented. 3 weeks during which she had also involuntarily learned an enormous amount about what vampires could and could not perceive about human bodies. Sorin could hear her heartbeat from across a room. He had admitted as much during the first week after her initial arrival, when she had still been naive enough to think that honesty about vampire capabilities was something he offered freely and without agenda. She had learned better. She had learned a great many things. "You know," she said, "because silence had never done her any favors, you cleared the room." That was interesting. Why clear the room if you were planning to invoke blood law? Something shifted at the edge of his expression. Not quite a smile, more like the memory of one. "I am not planning to invoke blood law." "Then what are you planning?" He was quiet for a moment. The torchlight moved across his face in slow, warm waves that were deeply at odds with the coolness of everything else about him. "I am planning," he said, "to ask you why." She had not been expecting that. She covered the surprise quickly, because she had also spent 3 weeks learning that showing surprise in front of Sorin Nocturne was roughly equivalent to handing him a map to whatever you were trying to protect. "Why I refused to kneel, why you came back." The question landed differently than anything else he had said tonight. She felt it settle somewhere low in her chest and stay there, because the inconvenient and deeply mortifying truth was that Eloise Sinclair had escaped the Obsidian Court 3 weeks ago, and 4 days ago she had walked back in through its gates voluntarily and without being caught. She needed to understand how that had happened. So did he, apparently. So she told him. 3 months earlier, Eloise had been 24 years old and working as a research archivist for a private library in Edinburgh that specialized in historical records of unusual provenance. Unusual provenance was a polite academic way of saying records that the rest of the world believed did not exist, including the complete internal census documents of the Obsidian Court dated to the 16th century, which the library had acquired through a chain of ownership so complicated and so old that no living vampire had known they were there. Until one of them did. She had been working late on a Thursday in November, the library cold and quiet around her, when the door had opened and Dravik had walked in, accompanied by 4 vampires she did not know, and a piece of paper she recognized immediately as a blood warrant, which she had only read about in the document she was paid to catalogue and absolutely never expected to encounter in person. They had taken her and the documents and brought her here, to a city beneath a city, to a court carved from black stone 500 feet below Edinburgh's old town, to stand before Sorin Nocturne and answer for the crime of knowing things she was not supposed to know, except that standing before Sorin had not gone the way Dravik had clearly anticipated. Sorin had read through the documents she had been cataloguing. He had asked her questions about them, sharp and specific questions that told her he was not merely curious, but genuinely engaged with what she knew and how she knew it. He had listened to her answers with the focused attention of someone who was accustomed to everyone in his vicinity performing for his approval rather than actually thinking, and who found the distinction startling and interesting. He had not imprisoned her. He had given her rooms, remarkable rooms with actual windows that looked out over the underground city's glowing blue spires and strange, beautiful streets. He had given her access to the court's own archives, which were 3 times the size of the Edinburgh Library, and contained documents she had only ever believed to exist in legends. He had invited her to dinner, which in the Obsidian Court meant an elaborate formal affair at a table long enough to seat 40, during which Sorin had ignored everyone else and directed the entire conversation at Eloise. It was, by any reasonable measure, a gilded cage. She was not free to leave. She was not a guest. She was a mortal who had stumbled into vampire politics and was being kept comfortable while those politics were sorted out around her. And she had been furious about it for approximately 2.5 weeks before she noticed that she was looking forward to dinner. Then she noticed that she was looking forward to the mornings when Sorin would sometimes appear in the archives where she worked and sit across from her and read while she researched. The two of them comfortable in the shared silence, the way people are only comfortable with someone they have known for a very long time, or someone they feel they have always, in some indefinable way, already known. Then she noticed that when Dravik spoke to her with barely concealed contempt, Sorin noticed and intervened in ways that were so controlled and precise. She was not certain Dravik was even aware they were interventions. That when any member of the court looked at her as though she were less than what she was, Sorin would redirect the entire conversation with the calm certainty of someone who did not need to raise his voice to make clear that this was not going to happen again. He was not kind in the way that people sometimes mean the word, with its implication of softness, of something easily given. He was kind in the specific and deliberate way of someone who chooses to be, who has had 5 centuries to become harder and colder and more indifferent and has chosen, actively, not to. She had started to understand why the court feared him, and she had started to understand something else about him at the same time, something that was not about fear at all, which was precisely when she had decided she needed to leave, because Eloise Sinclair was not a woman who made decisions based on what felt good in the moment. She was a woman who thought things through, who looked at the shape of a situation and traced it forward to where it led, and where this one led was a place she was not prepared to go. She was a mortal. He was a 500-year-old vampire lord. She had been brought here against her will. The power differential was not a small problem. It was a structural impossibility. Myra had found her. Myra was a young vampire by court standards, barely 80 years old, who served as one of the court's junior archivists and who had befriended Eloise with a directness and warmth that was unusual for her kind. Over the course of several late evenings, surrounded by old documents and the soft glow of archive lamps, Myra had told Eloise that there were old passages beneath the court, originally built as escape routes for the court's founding members, and that she could show her how to use them. Eloise had gone. She had packed only what she had arrived with, had slipped through corridors she had memorized over 6 weeks of careful observation, and had followed Myra through tunnels so old the stone was smooth with the passage of centuries, and emerged in a basement in Edinburgh's new town, and walked out into the November rain and been free. And then she had spent 3 weeks being free. She had gone to a hotel. She had slept for 16 hours. She had eaten an enormous breakfast and called no one. Because she could not explain where she had been without explaining things she did not believe she could explain. She had walked through Edinburgh and felt the cold and the rain and the normalcy of it against her skin, like something she should be grateful for. She had thought about the archives. She had thought about the underground city and its strange luminous beauty. She had thought about dinner conversations that lasted 3 hours because neither of them had wanted to stop. She had thought about the way Sorin had looked at her the morning before she left, across a table in the archives, and said, "You look tired." And she had said, "I sleep fine." And he had said, quietly, "That is not what I meant." And she had looked up from her documents and found him watching her with those winter-pale eyes, and that expression that was always 3 things at once. She had thought about all of that, and then she had done the thing she had sworn she would not do, which was look at it honestly, and looking at it honestly had eventually produced the answer she did not want. She had not been kept there against her will in any way that she could honestly maintain in the privacy of her own mind. She been kept safe, given access to resources she would never otherwise have encountered, and treated with a consistency of respect that she had, in point of fact, received from very few people in her life outside the pages of books. The gilded cage had stopped being a cage somewhere around the 3rd week, and she had run from what it had become instead, because what it had become was complicated and terrifying, and felt, in the dark honesty of 4 a.m, like something real. She had come back because she had realized that running from something real was a thing she had promised herself she would never do, and because there was Mira, who had helped her escape and who was now facing consequences for it. Eloise had known, walking back through those gates, that this was a problem she had caused, and that she was the only person who could fix it. Both things were true. She had learned, by 24, that it was possible for 2 very different kinds of true to exist in the same space. "Mira helped me," she told Sorin, in the empty hall, with the torchlight moving between them. "She did it because she thought I was being held here without real cause. She was not wrong about that at the start. What happens to her for it?" "Nothing," Sorin said. She looked at him. "That is not what your blood law says. My blood law says what I permit it to say." He said it without arrogance, simply as a fact. "I have 5 centuries of precedent, and I am the highest authority in this court." Mira acted on incomplete information and a sincere motivation to protect someone she considered a friend. "I am not going to punish her for that." Eloise was quiet for a moment, sorting through the implications. "But you made it look as though you were going to, in front of the court." "Yes, so that you could see what I would do." Something in his expression shifted, and this time it was unmistakable, not quite a smile, but something warmer and more specific, something she was going to need to find a better word for eventually. "You came back of your own will," he said. "You walked into this hall knowing what was likely waiting for you, and you refused, publicly, to name someone who had helped you, knowing it would make your situation significantly more dangerous. I wanted to know if you would do that." "A test," she said, and was surprised to find that she was not angry about it. "An answer," he corrected. "I already knew what you would do. I needed the court to see it." "Why?" He was quiet for a long moment, and the quiet had a different quality than his other silences. It was not the silence of someone choosing their words for maximum effect. It was the silence of someone choosing their words because they meant them, and meaning them was not something he did carelessly. "Because," he said, "I intend to ask you to stay, and the court needs to understand what you are before I do that." Eloise Sinclair was not a woman who lost her composure easily. She had the specific steady-handedness of someone who had learned young that falling apart was a luxury she generally could not afford. But something in the way he said that, the plainness of it, the absence of any performance or strategy, landed differently than she had been prepared for. "What am I?" she asked, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "Someone worth protecting," he said. "Someone the court should have treated accordingly from the beginning, and did not, because they have not had to think carefully about what that obligation looks like in practice. That changes now." The silence that followed had an entirely different quality from the one that had preceded his words. This one had weight and warmth and the particular quality of something that had been set in motion and could not be called back. "If I stay," she said carefully, "I need it to be clear that I stay because I choose to. Not because of blood law, not because of debts, not because of anything that is not my own decision." "Yes," he said, "and Mira faces no punishment whatsoever, and I continue to have access to the archives. You may have access to anything in this court that you wish." She looked at him for a long moment, reading the lines of his face with the attention she gave to difficult texts, looking for the places where the surface, meaning, and the deeper one diverged. She found none. That was the thing about Sorin. She had learned it slowly, and then, all at once, he was not someone who said things he did not mean. He had opinions he kept to himself, strategies he did not explain, depths he had not yet shown her, but he did not lie, not to her. She had never caught him in one, and she had, in 6 weeks of living in his court, tried more than once. "Then I would like to discuss the terms of what staying actually means," she said. The edge of his mouth moved. Definite this time, absolutely a smile. "Of course you would." What followed was 3 hours of conversation in the empty hall, the two of them eventually sitting on the steps of the dais, because standing for 3 hours was impractical, regardless of how dramatic the setting was. Eloise sat on the second step, with her knees pulled up and her notes spread beside her, and Sorin sat on the step below, angled to face her, closer than court protocol technically permitted, and neither of them acknowledging it. She had a list of conditions. He had known she would have a list, and he had come prepared with his own, which turned out to be considerably shorter than hers and amounted primarily to: "You will not attempt to leave without telling me first, and you will allow me to assign a protective detail when you move through areas of the court that remain politically unsettled." She argued with the protective detail on principle, and eventually conceded it on the grounds that the politically unsettled areas were genuinely dangerous, and she was not interested in dying for a point she could concede gracefully. He conceded, in turn, that her position in the court would be formally designated as court scholar rather than anything that implied ward or ward-adjacent status, that she would receive a stipend for her work, and that her access to the archives would include the restricted vaults, which had not been opened for a mortal in the court's entire history. "What is in the restricted vaults?" she asked. "The founding documents," he said. "The original blood laws, the first accords, the records from before the court moved underground. Things that have not been read by anyone in decades, because there was no one qualified to read them." She looked at him. "You knew I could read Old Court Gaelic." "I noticed it in Edinburgh. It was in your research notes." "You read my research notes." "Thoroughly," he said with an equanimity that was either extremely irritating or extremely disarming, and she had not decided which. The morning came slowly, the underground city's artificial dawn, cycling up through the tall windows in gradients of blue and pale gold, and neither of them noticed it until Mira appeared in the doorway, looking terrified and relieved and confused in equal measure, and said, "My lord, the council is asking whether— Eloise, you are here." "You are actually here." "She is here," Sorin confirmed, rising from the step with the effortless grace that she had stopped noticing and then started noticing again around week 4. "Tell the council the matter is resolved and that I will address them this afternoon, and tell them that Eloise Sinclair's position in this court is being formally established as court scholar, effective today, with all attendant protections and privileges." Mira looked from him to Eloise and back again with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously. "Yes, my lord," she managed. Sorin looked at Eloise. "You should sleep. The restricted vault can wait until you have rested. I am fine. You have been awake for approximately 20 hours, and you have the particular look of someone operating on stubbornness alone. That is my standard operating mode," she said. "I know," he said, and there was in it something layered and warm and absolutely devastating that she decided very firmly to process later when she was alone and not standing in his immediate vicinity. Nevertheless, she slept. She slept in the rooms she had left 3 weeks ago, which were exactly as she had left them, untouched, as though someone had been waiting for her return with enough conviction that disturbing anything would have been somehow wrong. She spent an hour before she slept looking at the ceiling and being completely honest with herself about what she was doing and why, and the honesty was uncomfortable and clarifying and ultimately necessary. And when she was done with it, she felt something settle in her chest that had not been settled in a very long time. She was here because she wanted to be. That was a true thing. She was staying because the alternative, the return to a normal life that had been before all of this, felt like putting away a color she had just learned to see. And she was a little in love with Sorin Nocturne, which was a complication, and also not a complication, and also the truest and most frightening thing she had acknowledged in years. The restricted vaults were extraordinary. She spent 3 days in them before she found the thing that changed everything, which was a document dated to the court's founding that contained, in its final pages, something that had apparently been believed lost for 300 years. Specifically, it contained the original wording of the blood accord that governed relations between the court and the mortal world. And the original wording was significantly different from the version currently in use. She brought it to Sorin at dinner, not through the formal channels that would have involved Dravik and the council, but directly, bypassing 3 layers of court protocol without quite meaning to, because she had found something important, and he was the person she wanted to show it to. She spread the document on the table between the dishes and said, "The current version of Article 7 of the Blood Accord says that any mortal who learns of the court's existence may be retained indefinitely at the court's discretion. The original version says retained for a period not to exceed 90 days, after which the mortal must be released, compensated, and bound to secrecy only by oath rather than force." Sorin looked at the document for a long time. Then he looked at her. "You realize what this means for your status here? It means you have been operating under a version of the blood law that was modified after the original founding. possibly without the original signatory's knowledge. It means my being here, under the current law, is potentially built on a document that was altered illegally. She met his eyes steadily. I want you to know that I found this, and I am showing it to you directly and openly, because that is the kind of person I am, and also because I want you to understand that I know about it. Something in his expression was very still, and then very warm, and then something else entirely, something that made the room feel smaller and quieter. You are showing me the evidence that could free you from any obligation to this court entirely. Yes, because you want me to know you know, because I want us to be clear with each other, she said, about everything. I do not want to stay here because the law says I must. I already established that. But I also do not want the foundation of whatever this is. She gestured between them. And it was not an entirely elegant gesture, but it was an honest one, to be built on a document that has not been verified. Sorin was quiet for a long time. The dinner around them cooled. The document will be authenticated, he said finally. I will convene the council. If it is genuine, and I believe it is, the blood law will be corrected and your status will be re-established accordingly, freely and without any coercive underpinning. Thank you. You know, he said, and his voice was different, quieter and more careful. I have had 500 years of people performing loyalty at me, showing me what they believe I want to see, telling me what they calculate I want to hear. I have become quite expert at recognizing it. I know you have, she said. You do not do it, he said. You have never done it, not once, in all the time you have been here. It seemed like a poor foundation for anything worth building, she said. The silence between them was the kind that means something is about to be said that changes the shape of things. Eloise, he said. I know, she said, because she did know. I am not certain how to say this without sounding. Then say it plainly, she said. You are the most plain speaker I have ever encountered when you choose to be. Be that? He looked at her, and for a moment the 5 centuries were visible in his face, not as age. His face would never show age, but as depth, as the accumulated weight of everything that had made him what he was, and underneath it, very clearly, someone who had been waiting a long time for something he had not known he was waiting for. I love you, he said. I have been trying to find a more appropriate framing for some time, and there does not appear to be one. I am aware of the structural complications. I am aware of the disparity in our natures and our situations. I am aware that you have every reason to find this information inconvenient. Inconvenient, she repeated, and the word came out with a warmth that she did not attempt to hide. I will not press you for anything, he said. I have no interest in using whatever authority I hold over this court to Sorin, she said. He stopped. I came back, she said. He was very still. I had 3 weeks, she said. I walked around Edinburgh in the rain, and I ate normal food, and I slept in a hotel bed, and I had complete freedom, and I thought about everything, and I came back. I want you to think about what that means. I have been thinking about it, he said continuously, since the moment you walked through those gates. Then you have probably reached the correct conclusion, she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, and his hand was cooler than hers and larger and completely steady, and she turned her palm up to meet it. And that, in the quiet and the candlelight with the cold dinner around them, was the beginning of something real. The council meeting the following week was not pleasant. Dravik had, of course, obtained his own copy of the restricted document through means she did not want to examine too closely, and he had arrived at the council chamber with 3 other senior council members, and a position paper arguing that the document's authenticity was inconclusive and that altering the established blood law on the basis of an unverified text would create dangerous precedent. Eloise sat to Sorin's right in the council chamber, which was itself a statement, because no mortal had ever sat in the council chamber before at all, let alone to the Lord's right. And Dravik's expression, when he saw her, there was the particular face of someone whose carefully managed sense of the world's proper order was developing structural problems. "The document has been verified," Sorin said, before Dravik could open his position paper by 3 independent scholars, one of whom is sitting in this room. "With respect, my lord," Dravik said, his tone suggesting no respect whatsoever, "a mortal scholar's verification of court documentation is not. The other 2 are Elder Kazavian and Archive Master Vethros," Sorin said, "unless you would like to contest their qualifications." Elder Kazavian was 2,000 years old and had been involved in writing original documentation for 7 different vampire courts across 3 continents. Archive Master Vethros was the oldest vampire in the northern reaches and had not been contradicted about anything in 400 years, because contradicting Vethros was the kind of thing people did once and then learned from. Dravik closed his position paper. "The blood law will be corrected," Sorin said. "The original text will be restored. Any mortal currently held under the previous version's provisions will have their status reviewed within 30 days. He paused. "This is not a matter for debate. This is an error in our founding documents that has been perpetuated for 300 years, and it ends now." "And the scholar," Dravik said, with a precision of contempt that was almost admirable. "Eloise Sinclair," Sorin said, and there was a quality to the way he said her name that functioned exactly like a warning, "holds her position in this court freely by her own will and under my direct protection. If anyone in this court has difficulty understanding what that means in practice, I am available to provide clarification." No one required clarification. What followed in the weeks after was not exactly peaceful, because a vampire court that had operated on certain assumptions for 3 centuries did not realign those assumptions quickly or quietly, but it was in its complicated way good. Eloise worked in the archives and found 3 more documents that required significant legal revision, which Sorin described as the most productively disruptive thing that had happened to the court in 200 years, and which Dravik described as a disaster. Though he was increasingly in the minority about that assessment, Myra became something close to a research partner, her knowledge of the court's internal history complementing Eloise's external archival training in ways that produced results neither of them could have reached alone. Elder Kasavian, who had initially regarded Eloise with the polite distance of someone uncertain what category to file her under, invited her to 3 separate lectures on pre-modern blood law and then to a long dinner, during which she apparently answered a question about 16th century documentation that had been puzzling him for 80 years, after which he began referring to hers as precisely the sort of person who belongs in a court of this caliber, which was as close to a ringing endorsement as he had given anyone in living memory. And Sorin was exactly what he had been from the beginning, except that now there was no pretense between them, no careful management of distance, no performing normalcy around something that was not normal at all. He arrived in the archives in the mornings and brought her coffee, because he had learned she was non-functional before coffee, and he had found this information and its implications fascinating and endearing in equal measure. He sat across from her and read or worked in parallel, and the silence between them was the specific, particular silence of two people who have stopped needing to fill the space. He told her about the court's history in the evenings, not the formal history, but the actual one. The decisions and the mistakes and the things that had cost him. And she listened the way she listened to everything, with her complete attention and without the performance of responses she thought he wanted. She told him about her life before the court, about the research and the quiet Edinburgh flat, and the sense she had carried for years that she was always standing slightly outside whatever was happening, close enough to observe it but never quite in it, that the world had never quite been the right size or shape for what she was. "And now," he asked. "Now it is the right size," she said. There was an evening in the 4th week after her return when things became briefly and genuinely dangerous, when a faction within the court that had been quietly organizing around Dravik's dissatisfaction made a move that was less quiet and considerably more alarming. Eloise came back from the archives, late to find 2 vampires in her rooms who were not there to have a scholarly conversation, and she had approximately 3 seconds to process this before Sorin came through the door behind her, with 2 of his personal guard, and an expression she had not seen on his face before, which was fury, pure and precise and completely cold. The 2 vampires were removed from her rooms with a speed and efficiency that made clear. This was not the first time Sorin's guard had managed this category of situation. Sorin stayed. He stood in the middle of her rooms and looked at her with those winter-pale eyes, and the fury was still in them, but underneath it was something else, something that was not cold at all. And she walked across the room and took his hand and held it, and he went very still. "I am fine," she said. "I know," he said. "I am." He stopped. "I know," she said. "This will not happen again," he said. And it was not a reassurance directed at her. It was a vow directed at himself, with the weight of 5 centuries of keeping vows behind it. "I know," she said again. "But Sorin." She waited until he looked at her. "I am not fragile. I do not need to be wrapped in glass. I need to be included in decisions about my own safety, and I need to know what is actually happening in this court. Not just what people calculate, I need to know. That is what protects me. Information." He looked at her for a long time. "You are right," he said. "I have been managing you. I apologize." She had not expected the apology. She absorbed it, and the fact that it was completely genuine. "That is what I mean," she said. "That right there, that is why I came back." After Dravik's faction attempted and failed to destabilize her position in the court, and Sorin had convened a formal hearing that resulted in Dravik being permanently reassigned to the southern reaches, which was as close to exile as the court's internal politics permitted, the atmosphere in the Obsidian Court changed. The change was not immediate, and it was not complete, and it would never be entirely free of the particular complications that came from being what they were to each other, but it was real. She was there by her own choice, and the court knew it. She had refused a direct order from the most powerful being in the room and been not punished, but listened to, which was its own kind of radical act in a court that had run on 5 centuries of unquestioned hierarchy, and the effect of that example rippled outward in ways that surprised her and did not surprise Sorin at all. 3 young court members, barely a century old each, submitted formal complaints about treatment they had experienced from senior members. The complaints were heard. One of the senior members was censured. It was small, as things went, but it was real. Mira was formally promoted to lead court archivist, which was a position that had not existed before Eloise proposed it, and which Sorin had established within a week. And Eloise published, through channels that she and Sorin established together over 2 months of careful negotiation with both the court and the human academic world, a series of papers on pre-modern European historical documentation that did not mention vampires by name, but which drew on the court's archives in ways that the historical scholarship community found remarkable, and which she found genuinely satisfying on every level, because she was at her core a scholar, and the work was excellent. The evening that the first paper was formally accepted by the journal she had submitted it to, Sorin appeared in the archives where she had been working, and she looked up from her desk and saw the expression on his face, that layered, specific thing that still needed its own word, and she felt something warm and completely uncomplicated in her chest. "They accepted it," she said. "I know," Mira told me. He crossed the archive and sat across from her, and he was looking at her the way he sometimes looked at her when he thought she was occupied and would not notice, with an openness that his public face never quite allowed. "How does it feel?" "Good," she said. "It feels genuinely, uncomplicatedly good." "You deserve that," he said. "Genuinely and uncomplicatedly." She smiled at him, and something in his expression shifted in that way it did. That particular way she had been studying for months and still felt was not quite fully mapped. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me." "I think about the morning I left," she said. "I have thought about it many times. I think about the fact that I was afraid, not of you, not exactly, of the feeling, of what it would mean to stay for the reason I actually wanted to stay. Because the logical reasons were good, the archives and the work and the restored blood law, but they were not the main reason, and I was avoiding that." "I know," he said. "I know you know," she said. "I know you have always known, which is another thing about you that is simultaneously impressive and a little maddening, a recurring theme." "Yes." She folded her hands on the desk and looked at him steadily, the way she looked at text she intended to understand completely. "I love you." I said it sideways before, in the dinner conversation about returning and foundations, and it was true then, but it was sideways. And I want to say it directly now, because you said it directly to me, and that was very brave and deserves to be met equally. Something moved through his face, like light, quiet and profound and absolutely certain. "I am aware," she continued, because she was going to say the whole thing, "that there are complications, that I am mortal and you are not, and that this is not a problem with a simple solution, and that we would need to discuss it and think about it carefully and make decisions together rather than have it decided for me or around me." "Yes," he said, "we would." "I want to have that discussion," she said, "when we are ready. I am not asking for anything today except that you know I am not here in spite of what I feel. I am here because of it." He rose from his chairs and came around the desk and took her face in his hands with a gentleness that was completely at odds with everything the court thought it knew about him, and looked at her with those extraordinary eyes for a long moment that had its own kind of quality, its own specific weight and warmth. "I have been waiting," he said, "for 500 years, for someone who does not want me to perform, who does not want the court or the power or the 5th-century mythology, who wants the actual person underneath all of that. I want that person," she said. "I have wanted that person for considerably longer than I was willing to admit to myself." He kissed her, and it was nothing like the dramatic collision of a moment that had been building forever. It was quiet and deliberate and completely sure, the way he did everything, and she kissed him back the same way, and the archives around them were very still, and the artificial dawn was beginning outside the tall windows in its slow gradients of blue. The conversation about mortality and its implications came 6 months later, on a winter evening when they had been sitting in the private library off his quarters for 3 hours reading, companionably, and she had closed her book and said, "I want to talk about the longer question." He had closed his own book and given her his complete attention, which was still one of the things she loved most about him. The way he was completely present when she needed him to be, no performance, no strategy, all of it directed entirely at her. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what the options actually are. I have read the documentation. I know the process. I know the blood law as it currently stands, the real version. And I know that there is a choice that exists and that you have not brought it up because you are waiting for me to decide whether I want to discuss it." "Yes," he said. "I want to discuss it," she said. "Not decide, not yet. Discuss." What followed was the longest and most careful conversation she had ever had, and she had had some very careful conversations. They talked about the transformation process, and what it meant physiologically, and what it meant for her work and her connections to the human world. They talked about what she would lose and what she would gain. They talked about the fact that it had to be her choice, entirely and without pressure of any kind, and that Sorin had a stake in the outcome that they both acknowledged openly, because pretending otherwise would have been dishonest. "I want you to know," he said, at one point, with that particular quietness, "that I will love you for whatever time we have, regardless of what you choose. I am not going to manage the length of that time against you. I am not going to hold the ending as a weight over this. I know," she said, "that is part of why the choice is easier than it would otherwise be." She paused. "I am not there yet. I need more time." "Take all the time you need," he said. "We have time." "We do," she agreed. They did. She spent another year in the archives and in the court and in the underground city and in his company and in the particular life they were building together, which was not like any life she had anticipated for herself, and which fit her, genuinely and precisely, in a way that still sometimes surprised her with its rightness. She made her choice at the end of that year on a morning in November, the same month she had first come to the court. Sitting in the restricted vault with her notes and her coffee and the founding documents spread around her, and she held the decision in her mind and turned it over and looked at all its faces and found that she was certain. She told him at dinner, because that was where they had always had the conversations that mattered. "I have decided," she said. He put down his fork and looked at her. "Yes," she said. He was very still for a long moment. Then he said, "Are you certain?" "I have been certain for 3 months, and I waited to make sure the certainty stayed," she said. "It has stayed." "Tell me why," he said. "Not because I doubt it, because I want to hear you say it." She thought about it for a moment, though the thinking was not difficult. It was more the finding of the right words for something she had been carrying for a long time. "Because I have spent my life looking for the place where I fit," she said, "and I have found it. Here, in these archives, in this work, in this court, with you, and I would like to keep it. Not because I am afraid of losing it, but because it is worth keeping, because you are worth keeping." She met his eyes across the table. "And because I have thought about every alternative honestly and directly, which you know I always do, and the alternative to this is a return to a life that would always feel too small. I do not choose this because I have no other options. I choose it because it is the truest thing I have found." He reached across the table and took her hand. His thumb traced a slow arc across her palm, and the gesture was familiar now in the way of things that have become part of the fabric of a shared life. "Then we will do this carefully," he said, "on your timeline, at your pace, with nothing decided around you or without you." "As always," she said. "As always," he agreed. The process was indeed careful and slow and done on her terms, and when it was complete, she stood in their private rooms in the grey morning light, and felt the world differently, and turned to look at him where he waited, and the expression on his face was the one that still needed its own word, and always would, because the right word for it was probably just him. "Well," she said, her voice the same, herself the same in every way that mattered, only more so. "The archives are going to find me very difficult to remove now." The sound he made was something she had heard exactly twice before. Once when she had surprised him in the archives with a particularly rare original text, and once on the night she had told him she loved him directly. It was a laugh, genuine and unguarded, and three things at once, and it filled the room the Obsidian Court found, over the years that followed, that having a court scholar who was also the Lord's bonded partner, and who had personally corrected 300 years of accumulated legal errors in the founding documents, was an extraordinary asset, and also occasionally a challenge. Because Eloise Sinclair did not stop being exactly herself, simply because her circumstances had changed. She continued to argue, to push to find the documents that complicated things, to refuse to perform responses she did not feel, and to treat every person who crossed the archive threshold as someone capable of contributing something worth hearing. The court, slowly and then all at once, became something different. Not the court of blood law and unquestioned hierarchy, not the court that had taken a mortal woman from a library in Edinburgh and kept her in gilded captivity. Something older than that. Something that matched the founding documents more closely than the altered versions had allowed. A court built on accord and earned respect, and the recognition that power used only to enforce itself is power that has forgotten its own purpose. Dravik, in the southern reaches, was by all accounts doing perfectly adequate work and gradually developing, under the influence of a regional council that had its own long history of practical negotiation, a more nuanced understanding of how governance actually functioned. He sent a formal letter of congratulation on the occasion of Eloise and Sorin's bonding ceremony that was stiff and formal and entirely correct, and Sorin read it and said it was the most progress he had seen from Dravik in 60 years, which was possibly an exaggeration and possibly not. Mira published her own research on pre-modern court history, citing Eloise extensively, and the paper won 3 separate honors in the academic circles where such things were tracked, and she celebrated by staying in the archives until 2 in the morning reading documents she had never had formal access to before, and eating sandwiches that Eloise had brought down, and the 3 of them, Eloise, Mira, and Sorin, who had arrived in the archives with no pretense of working and had simply sat on the floor with them because it seemed the right thing to do, stayed until the artificial dawn came up around them. The great hall of the Obsidian Court still had the obsidian throne at its far end, and the rows of carved columns rising to the shadowed ceiling, and the cold blue light of the underground city visible through the tall windows. It still held court on formal occasions, still maintained the old ceremonies that had meaning, because meaning accumulated over centuries, and was not lightly set aside. But it was also the hall where a mortal woman had stood with her chin lifted and refused a direct order, and the world had shifted on its axis, where a lord of 5 centuries had chosen to clear the room, rather than invoke a law he did not intend to use, where 2 people had sat on the steps of a throne for 3 hours, and built the beginning of something that was going to last. When Eloise walked through the great hall now, which she did regularly because it was the most direct route between the East Wing archives and the private library, she sometimes paused at the spot in the center of the marble floor where she had stood that night. She would look at the obsidian throne at the far end, and at the empty room, and at the tall windows with the city glowing beyond them, and she would feel it all precisely. The terror of that first moment, the weight of 300 years of tradition cracking, the lifting of her chin, the word no, said clearly and without flinching. Sorin would sometimes find her there, because he had not in all their years together stopped finding where she was when she was quiet in a particular way, and he would come to stand beside her in the center of the floor and follow her gaze to the throne and the windows and the room. Thinking about your extremely illegal entry into vampire court proceedings? He asked, the first time he found her there, early in the years after everything had changed. My extremely principled refusal, she corrected. The court had never witnessed a mortal refuse a direct order, he said, and she could hear the smile in it, that specific warm thing that had needed its own word all these years and still did. Until you. The court needed the education, she said. The court, he said, needed you. He took her hand in the center of the empty hall, exactly the way he had not, quite on that first night, maintaining all the proper distances and protocols that she had subsequently dismantled one by one. So did I. She turned to look at him, and he was still exactly what he had been the first time she had truly seen him, past the performance and the authority and the mythology, extraordinary and real and completely himself. She had still not found the right word for the expression he was wearing, but she had decided this was not a failure of language, it was a feature. Some things were better held in the space where the word would be, better experienced than named. She leaned up and kissed him in the middle of the obsidian hall, in the cold blue light of the underground city, with centuries of tradition around them and the founding documents in the restricted vaults, with all their careful revisions, and the whole vast living architecture of a court that had been, slowly and certainly, becoming something worth belonging to. When she pulled back, she was smiling, and he was looking at her with that expression, and the hall was quiet around them in the particular way of a place that has accumulated significance and knows it. Come on, she said, the archives. There is always the archives, he said. There will always be the archives, she agreed, and took his hand and led him toward the door, and the morning was coming up in its blue gradients beyond the windows, and everything ahead of them was time.